morning. Welcome inside Mr. Small's Theater in Millvale, Pennsylvania. I apologize for the delay, but Gike's Guide game is underway from now until the top of the hour. Thanks to Nick Graybeal for forging through some technical issues this morning. We appear to have some things figured out. Unfortunately, though, we'll have to pass on today's featured guest. We'll talk to my good friend and hardy golf pro up in the alcove of Erie, Pennsylvania. Tough place to be a golf pro for half the year, but Eric Barzeski was going to join us to talk about how to keep your game in shape during the off season. I want to try to do some more participatory sports segments, especially with experts like Eric, but we'll push that on back to next week at the earliest. We will get to that, I promise, in addition to more interesting features like that on how to lift your level as a competitor, if you are one. And I think if you do follow sports, you probably were a player first before you were a fan, or maybe that came along at the same time. Anyway, this isn't your typical sports talk radio, as you could probably tell, and this is not your typical radio station here at the River's Edge. We are online only, but that increasingly seems less important as the years go along, doesn't it? We attempt to serve the Pittsburgh area, but also provide a global perspective on certain issues and news, talk, opinion, and like I said, your dose of sports here every Friday from 10 to 11 live, and then after the fact, you can find the podcast version on riversedgepgh.com. Thank you to Jared for throwing a song request in there. He wanted to hear Jimmy Eat World, apparently, while we tried to get things wrapped up. Jared, as usual, inserted his commentary, his take on what was going on Facebook, and you can interact with the show that way. Go to my page, Matt Gajtka Media, and my last name is spelled Gajtka, and fire a comment down there. I'll do my best to address it and get to what you wanted to talk about before the end of the show. You can also find me on Twitter, and boy, I get some good feedback on topic number 1 on today's show, so I'm excited to bring so many of you who did respond on Twitter. Matt Gajtka, Mattgajtka, no underscores, no spaces, nothing in between on there. Coming up later in the hour, I do want to discuss, multiple topics here. I want to get to the sport of hockey, as I usually do, your weekly Penguins report. The ups and the downs of the 2018-19 season continue on, just when you thought it was getting a little bit smoother and a little bit easier for the local hockey club. Not so much on Wednesday night at Chicago. On the bright side for them, they have a 5 games in 7 days stretch in which to address some issues and probably work some things out on the ice. And like I have said in previous weeks, I think that's the best thing this team can do. Play some games, not have to worry about big trades coming from upstairs, and see what you have. See what this team looks like, because I feel like they haven't really had that opportunity so far this year. So that's on the way. In addition to what I hope will become a recurring segment, Lord knows I have plenty of opinions on it. As you probably figured out last week, I like to talk sports fashion, uniforms in particular. And so this week, I'm going to praise the glories of color on color in terms of uniform matchups. And that came to the NHL last week for the first time since I was in high school. Yes, that's a long time ago. And I'll have further details a little bit later. But as I want to start today's show, and if you've been following me on Twitter this morning, it's been about American tackle football. Yes, I don't often wade into those waters these days because I don't watch as closely as I used to, but there's been one aspect of football that came into the news, if you're a Steelers fan, certainly, and has always been a part of the game, at least as long as the NFL has been in existence and also major college football. I'm talking place kicking. Does place kicking have a place in American football? You may say, well, yeah, it always has been. Why would you take kicking away? There are field goals, there are extra points. The leading scorer in the NFL year after year for the last 3-4 decades is always a kicker. And I'm not questioning that fact, but I'm questioning, is it right? Is the tradition appropriate? Why do we do this? Why do we take the break from the brutal game that is tackle football to kick a ball through the air, to decide many games? And as the Steelers have seen this year with their kicker, who's the same kicker that they've had for the past 3 years, who's been really good, Chris Boswell, it can be increasingly fickle. And I know that sports aren't always going to be fair, but I think we can strive for fairness, right? And when a team drives down the field only to see their kicker unable to convert at the end when they did what they could as a team, that strikes me as odd, and it strikes me as something that can be fixed. And you'll have to bear with me if you feel like that football shouldn't be fixed in this way, but I hope to convince you here because, in a way, I think this is the strangest arrangement in big-time pro sports worldwide. There is no sport where a player who doesn't really take part in the action that is primary to the sport all of a sudden jumps into the action and can decide games, both for the positive and for the negative. And like I said, with Chris Boswell, I'm not just saying this because I'm being a homer because I grew up rooting for the Steelers. I'm using this as my entry point to make an argument. I think it's a pretty good argument, honest to God, because you look around sports, you look at baseball, and I saw on Twitter this morning some people were saying, well, you know, closers in baseball, relief pitchers, they come in, they don't play every inning, they don't play every day. But they often are in the game, and they decide the game in some ways at the highest leverage moments. And I'm not going to argue with that, but at least a relief pitcher is still a pitcher. And pitching is one of the three main components of a baseball game. There's pitching, there's hitting, and there's fielding, right? And I suppose you could throw base running in there too, but I lump that into hitting with the offensive side. So pitching is a crucial action to baseball. So I don't think relief pitchers are comparable. They're not analogous to place kickers in football. Some others would say the goon in hockey or the player who doesn't play a lot in a sport like hockey. Well, they don't really have that big of an influence on the game. Maybe if they throw a hit, an illegal hit that knocks a star player out of the game, they do, but I'm talking about within the legal framework of the game. They do not have that big of an influence. They are not that high leverage. Basketball. I saw another mention on Twitter about the high percentage free throw shooter who gets inserted into the game late as a substitution. Of course, basketball allowing substitutions like that throughout the game, unlike some other sports. That player can have an outsized influence, even though he or she has only played a handful of minutes, if that, over the course of the game. But again, free throw shooting is usually a way to salt away a game. It's not a way to decide a game necessarily. Can it decide a game? Yes, it can. But typically, this is after one team already has a sizable advantage. In the case of place kicking in football, you can go from, obviously, 2 down to 1 up and win the game. You can go from 3 down to tied and go to overtime. You know the permutations. I don't have to spell that out for you. You're smart enough to realize that. The kicker is a specialist, and I don't understand why, in this sport where you fight brutally for territory, whether you're trying to push the ball down the field or prevent the other team from pushing the ball down the field. I realize there are specialists within the game. You have offensive linemen. They do something totally different from wide receivers or from quarterbacks or from running backs. But at the same time, they're all combining into a common cause, right? They're trying to move the ball down the field. So they're all united in that way. And I will admit that compartmentalization, if you will, of tackle football has always struck me as odd too, because I like the sports basketball, soccer, hockey, where everyone can feasibly score, everyone can defend. There is no hyper-specialization there. That strikes me as more of a true sport, more of what sports are supposed to be, not necessarily, well, you do this little thing and you do that little thing. Although you could argue that football in many ways mirrors the workplace the most. And maybe that's why a lot of us relate to it, because we can do our job, but someone else can fail to do their job, and all of a sudden the whole effort goes kaput. Or we all do our job well. They're very different jobs, but what makes it satisfying is that even though we're all different, we can push toward a common cause in that way. So I understand the appeal if you talk about crossover with real life, and a lot of times I do discuss that on this show. So I'll let that go. But to put a kicker into a game who has been sitting on the sideline warming up his leg, whether it be for a kickoff or a place kicking situation, and to allow him to score either 3 points at a time or 1 point at a time, when all this effort is going into getting that touchdown, right, to pushing the ball up the field, it strikes me as very odd. And I think if an alien came down from outer space, or someone who was not familiar with our version of football, American football, if you will, and you had them watch a game, they would wonder the same thing. I haven't had this experience watching a game with someone who's completely foreign to football, our version of football again, as an entity. I've not had that experience, but I would imagine he or she would think, well, what is this now? Why are we changing the game drastically? Suddenly we're kicking the ball. I think punting would also go in that area, but I'm willing to allow punting to continue on in my ideal version of tackle football, because at least that is working with field position. You punt the ball because you can't move it down the field. So, okay. And that also strikes me as closer to the origins of American football, which come from a sport that was close to what we call rugby today, where the ball is punted and moved down the field that way. But place kicking is totally different. And for me, it's a bastardization of what this sport is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be, and pardon the expression, it is a war game, though. We are fighting for territory. You hear all the cliches like trenches and field generals. Well, that's for a reason, because it's meant to mimic war in that way. You're moving up and down the field. You're taking territory away from your opponent, or you're preventing your opponent from taking your territory. So that is, I think we can all agree, that is the essence of football, right? And if we want to, I'm willing to concede in a couple of ways. I'm willing to say, okay, say if you get past the 30-yard line, that's an automatic 3 points. And that may strike some as strange, but for the most part, in kicking in the NFL these days, you get past the 30, about 80% of the time, you're going to get 3 points. I don't have the exact numbers on that, but let's agree on that. That's almost assured there. So you can still award points based on how far you advance. If you want to, you can give 1 point for getting past midfield. So field position is awarded in that way. I'm willing to make a lot of changes in the scoring system, but I am not willing to stand by, if I do have control over where this sport is going, and allow place kicking to continue to have such an outsized influence on the sport. Here's a couple of people chiming in on Twitter. Brian says, the kicker is a specialist, but you don't need to eliminate field goals and extra points. Just make the rule that the kicker has to be someone on the field the previous play. Now, that's interesting. I'll concede you that. What if Chris Boswell has to block for a running play or run a route as a wide receiver on the previous play before he goes in to kick? All right, that's interesting. And as Brian says, Unix ADM on Twitter, I'll give the handle as well. Brian says that would be fun. I don't disagree with that. That would definitely at least make the kicker more of an integral part of the game, but at the same time, you would still have an artificialness to this. And I don't want to, why are we making all these other rules to accommodate for a kicking rule that at its base is very strange and very different from the rest of a football game? Jerry, my good friend Red Buppy on Twitter, says, when rosters were at 33, there was no room for a specialized kicker, let alone a long snapper. So, yes, if you were the center, you were also the long snapper. If you were the quarterback, you were also the holder. If you were the kicker, you probably had to do something else. And that has changed as the rosters have expanded, and it gives more room for specialization. So perhaps we have only the NFL itself to blame, and it wanting to expand rosters and make the game more specialized from an 11-on-11 perspective. Like I said, it didn't used to be this way. You used to have players who played two ways. It used to be more like the other sports. Tackle football did, where you played offense and defense for the most part, and still it's played that way at the high school level at a lot of smaller schools. My school, Madonna in Weirton, West Virginia, we didn't have a lot of players, so if you wanted to play football, you had to play both ways. And if you wanted to be a specialist, you wanted to be a kicker, like my brother was, and I speak not as a bias against kickers, but just as a logical human being. Obviously, as I said, I have a kicker in the family, but at the same time, you couldn't just be a kicker in high school. So Jerry, continuing with his discussion here, with his input, he says, if you don't like the specialization, people occasionally champion the idea that anybody place kicking must have participated in a scrimmage play first. So much like Brian earlier, who was talking about needing the kicker to have been on the field for the previous play, Jerry says just play in any play that's from scrimmage, not a kicking play. All right, that's fine, but still for me, you're keeping kicking in the game, and I know the sport itself has the word foot in it, but it's not really football. It's throw ball at this point. It's run ball. It is not anywhere near where it was at its origin. I don't think that's changing. So part of me is practical in saying, okay, football is not going to be drastically different from that perspective. It's not going to go back to being closer to rugby because people tend to like tackle football better than rugby, especially in this country. So let's just take place kicking completely out of it. And I think this will also benefit place kickers because, if we're being honest, place kickers are ostracized in the sport of football, whether it be inside the locker room and especially out in the general community. As you see this week with Chris Boswell, a lot of frustration with him. Just cut him, get rid of him. What good is he? When he's good, everyone loves him. When he's bad, everyone hates him. I'm not sure that's any different from most other sports, but I think the resentment toward kickers when things go bad is especially heightened because they do come in, and it's perceived that quote unquote, they have only one job, so they have to do it. And I'm not going to disagree with that, but why put them in that position either? It's a completely unfair position to put a player in, I think. So I think the place kickers would be better off. Go play a different sport. Go play soccer. Why wouldn't you play soccer if you had a great leg? Maybe you don't like running around for that long, but too bad, in my opinion. Keep football a battle for territory and make soccer the game where you go and kick. Or play Aussie rules football or play rugby. There are plenty of options for athletes who are good with their legs, good at propelling implements long distances with their legs. And I think it would get rid of that separation that occurs in the locker room and also within the general sporting public between the kickers and the rest of the football team. I guess I'll put punters over there too. But like I said, I think punters have a role in a game that is based primarily on field position and taking territory. So for me, punters are still integral to football. So that'll keep the foot in football, right? But if you take kickers out, I think most of us would like the game better. It would also increase the stakes a little bit more. If you didn't have that 30-yard line gives you 3 points sub-rule that I would be willing to adopt, then that would really raise the stakes, right? You'd see a lot more teams going for on fourth down, more exciting in that way. You would have to make, I think, more high-stakes decisions, and people love getting on the coaches and acting like they are the coach and figuring out, well, how would I decide? What would I do if I were in this situation? That would only lead to more situations like that, where you get inside the 20, right? And well, you're not going to punt there, so you're going to go for it on 4th and 8. And I think fourth down attempts from a scrimmage play situation, from that standpoint, are much more exciting than watching someone line up to kick a ball through the uprights. It's all completely random. Get rid of the uprights. Just toss them out, and let's play the game as it has been intended to play, as it has evolved. Well, where it is a game of moving the ball up and down the field or trying to stop the opponent from moving the ball down the field. We'd be better off. I think the teams would be better off. Everyone would be united on a common cause. There wouldn't be this player off to the side that, like the Steelers this week, they have to try to get right, even though he doesn't participate in the vast majority of the plays. It's really rather strange, and I hope that at least this argument in segment 1 of Gike's Guide Game for this week at least let you start to think about why we have place kicking in football. Okay, time for a break. When we come back, it'll be all hockey the rest of the way, although at least in one area, it's more about sports in general and how I think there can be a change in how we approach a very basic part of pro sports and really high-level sports across the globe that we don't need to have that way. We're challenging conventions on Gike's Guide Game this morning. I am Matt Geica. This is The River's Edge. Hope to see you back on the other side of the break.
Hey, it's Mike Sasson. Guess what? You used to love us at 10. You're going to love us even more at 9. It's me. It's Alex. It's funniness. It's guests. It's all sorts of me yelling into microphones only 1 hour earlier. It's exactly what you need at 9 o'clock. It's like a shot of adrenaline. It's the Mike Sasson Show, now starting at 9 o'clock on Tuesday on the River's Edge, a new kind of radio.
Hey, welcome back inside Mr. Small's Theater. As you can tell, we've moved on from football to hockey, but I do still want your input on my proposal to just eliminate place kicking from football. We'd all be happier, to be honest. Well, we can then, for instance, last week, I'm continuing on this rant. I'll keep it going for just right now. This is Gike's Guide Game, by the way, on the River's Edge. Just last week, no one is talking about that really cool hook and ladder play the Steelers ran to get themselves into field goal range where Boswell slipped on the turf. I'm not even saying that was Chris Boswell's fault. The turf was awful at Oakland Alameda County Coliseum as the Steelers lost to the Raiders, the latest kicking mishap that has cost Pittsburgh this season. But the toss from the rookie James Washington to Juju Smith-Schuster, he's running down the sideline. It's a great moment. Should have won the game. Probably would have won the game in most situations. Instead, for some reason, we allow these games between these gladiators to come down to place kicking. I don't understand it. I think deep down we all don't understand it. We accept it. Why do we accept it? Let's just move it along. And honestly, football has been pretty progressive in making changes. I think this would be as big of a no-brainer change as the NFL has ever had. So anyway, there you have it. Last year the Steelers were 13-3. They probably got at least 2 of those wins strictly on Chris Boswell's clutch kicking, maybe even 3 or 4. This year they're looking like they might finish around 500, even in danger if they lose out of having the first losing record in Mike Tomlin's tenure as coach. I'm not sure they're that bad, though. They're somewhere in between, both years, somewhere in between, and we allow kicking to introduce this artificial variation. That's the best way I can probably put it. Anyway, I'm Matt Gajka, Mattgajtka. Nick Graybeal, my fellow son of Marshall, fellow Marshall University alum, is alongside for the second straight week. Good to have him there. And Nick has thrown up a photo, I want to credit Getty Images for this one, of a hockey game that people in Pittsburgh probably didn't even pay any attention to last week. It was last Friday, I believe, maybe last Thursday. It was last week, nevertheless, as the Carolina Hurricanes traveled to Anaheim, California to take on the Ducks, and the Hurricanes won it by the score of 4-1. Like I said, you don't really care. The Hurricanes are in the Penguins Metropolitan Division, but the Canes aren't exactly a rival at this point, so it probably passed by and you didn't even notice it. But what you should notice from that picture behind me is that both teams are wearing their dark uniforms. Both teams are wearing their color uniforms. It was a color-on-color matchup for you uni-wonks and nerds out there, of which I am a card-carrying member. I visit UniWatch blog very often. I'm a frequent visitor to Chris Creamer's website, which has been on top of sports logos and uniforms for a long time, too. So if you're part of that cohort, you know what I'm talking about. You probably already recognized what I was going to discuss here by the time you saw the photo behind me. And if you're just listening, we see the Ducks in their black uniform, predominantly black, against the Hurricanes in their predominantly red uniform. And typically in sports, you see a team wearing white and a team wearing their color uniform. And this was instituted back in the day, this tradition, when a lot of people had black and white TVs, and it was tough to tell the difference between teams if you didn't have color on your screen. Well, I don't have to tell you that we're well past those days now. We not only have color, we also have high definition, super high definition, in fact. And it's been extremely kind to games like hockey, where the puck previously was pretty tough to track. So hockey, in my view, is the sport that should most embrace color because they're working with a white canvas, if you will. It's not like football. And you might remember last week I said that I didn't like the LA Kings uniforms because they were black and white and gray. But on the other side of the coin, as I was reminded this past weekend with the Steelers out there in Oakland, I love the Raiders uniforms. Why? I'm not sure I can entirely say why we all have the taste that we do and why certain things are aesthetically pleasing, but I can say, scientifically speaking, the canvas, quote unquote, that football teams are working on is green, so you can get away with a little less color in football and it still can look pretty good. Also, the Raiders use that silver, that metallic silver, which adds to it. They're not just white and black like the LA Kings are primarily. My problem in hockey is that it washes it all out. If you just have a black uniform with white trim, not very good. It's just black and white. If you just have a white uniform with black trim on a white backdrop, it's all white, and it looks washed out. So that, in my opinion, is why hockey should be the sport that embraces this, color on color, more often. This was the first game, this last week, the first game featuring color on color since 2002, since way back when I was in high school, since the earliest part of this century, 16 years ago. Again, I don't have to lay that out for you. It's been a long time since the last time we saw it. It was Montreal wearing its signature red uniforms at home against the Broadway Blue Shirts, the New York Rangers. So it was blue against red. Now, for instance, last night we had the Sharks play the Stars. Teal against green probably wouldn't work. It'd be tough for the referees, might be tough for the players to figure out who's who. But as long as there's no clash in that way, as long as these two primary colors on the ice aren't too similar where there'd be confusion, why not do this? Soccer does this a lot, and again, I feel like soccer does a lot of things right. It's not a perfect sport, obviously, but I think soccer and having what they call they don't even say home and road kits in soccer, and yes, a kit is a uniform in soccer, another term that I tend to mix into my lexicon, but they just have primary, secondary, and clash kits, as they call them in soccer. So for the most part, they don't do white on dark. They do color against color. If two teams don't have a conflict in their primary colors, then they wear the same ones, and it looks rather well. It looks really good to me. That's at least my feeling on it. I'm always in favor of more color, and especially, like I said, in hockey. So more hockey teams need to do this. And who instigated this? Well, it was the most interesting team in hockey right now, the Carolina Hurricanes. they have to try to do some different things. You've seen their post-game, their post-win celebrations where they're jumping into the glass. They're doing the rhythmic clap a la the Iceland national soccer team with their fans, try to get them engaged. Their owner is probably the most interesting owner in all of sports, Tom Dundon. He's trying to do different he's trying to employ different techniques to get people to pay attention to his hockey team. It's a non-traditional market. It's a market that hasn't been to the playoffs in nearly a decade. It will be a decade this spring. So they have to think outside the box, think outside the rink, if you will, in this situation. And so it doesn't surprise me that the Carolina Hurricanes were the team that decided, well, when we go on the road, we're not going to wear white like everybody else does. We'll wear our dark uniform. And that's what they did on their West Coast trip. They wore red against the Kings, they wore red against the Sharks, and they wore red, as you see here, against the Anaheim Ducks. And the Ducks were the only team on that trip, that 3-game Western swing, to agree to wear their dark uniform. Both the Sharks and the Kings decided to wear their white. So, as you can see, it's like pulling teeth to try to get these teams to do something different, to go away from tradition. I think it's entirely appropriate, and I just love what I'm seeing back behind me here. I think it's extremely attractive. And if you have a color as a team, show off that color. If you're the Penguins, wear your black or wear your gold more often, right? Wouldn't that be interesting to see the Penguins in gold on the road against the Canadiens in red or against the Rangers in blue? Wouldn't that be terrific? Wouldn't that really pop? And I think we could owe it to ourselves to try to maximize the beauty of this sport, which is already a beautiful game. But as I've been saying, sometimes certain traditions lag behind, and let's push things ahead. We're a very progressive sporting public here on Geiks Got Game. And, at times, maybe I can go a little too far, but I think in this case it's an entirely reasonable ask. So I'm going to try to keep talking about uniforms in sports. I think it's an interesting topic. I think that's part of the reason why I love sports so much, because it is that swirl of color. It's when it's attractive, when it's like Steelers and Raiders, as we saw last week. Raiders in their white and their silver, the Steelers in their black and their gold. Didn't that look terrific? Isn't it better when the games look great? And we all have a different interpretation of what's great, but there are certain principles that I think we can agree to, at least most of us can agree to, and unite this nation of ours, which is so divided at times. Coming back to finish up the show, we'll do our weekly Penguins report, and I'll talk about one aspect of the Penguins that I still think, even though it came into sharp focus this offseason with a controversial move, it's still underappreciated in hockey generally, how much of an influence that the blue line has on how a team plays, and not just defensively, also at the offensive end in modern hockey. I am Matt Geica. This is my show, Geiks Got Game. Back to finish it up in just a moment.
Dun dun da 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 dun dun da 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 da. It's 2017. We've cleaned shit up here in Pittsburgh. Something that the governor has done that is just, it's got me giddy. I want money from Hempfield. That's what I want. Give us your cash. But why would you put trees up in front of a restaurant that views the river? If I'm going to a river-viewing restaurant, I want to actually view the river. Am I crazy?
Catch River Talk with Brian Crawford, Mondays at 10 a.m. here on the River's Edge.
This is the real shit, folks.
Back inside Mr. Small's Theater. Final period, third period on Geiks Got Game. It's a condensed show this week, but I'm trying to get as much into it before the 11 o'clock hour strikes and I turn into a pumpkin. I'm Matt Geica, MattGajtka on social media, both Twitter and Facebook. And thank you to the viewers, live viewers on Facebook. And you can access this show video version on my page, on the River's Edge page, whenever you want to. It's stored there on the platform, and it's also on River's Edge, pgh.com, under the podcast page. So there's plenty of opportunities to catch up if you have missed previous episodes. Next week, I will not be doing this show live, so just a reminder there, headed up to the state of Michigan for holiday celebrations with my wife's family, with the in-laws. Always enjoyable to head up that way into the Great White North. So, in fact, back-to-back Fridays, I will not be able to do this show live. Just a note to you loyal viewers out there. And I'll do my best on social to get you the times that will be on the air next week and the following week as well before we head into 2019. One last thing before I go, the hockey report. We got to talk Penguins because it's always front of mind for me, and I don't know it is for most of you if your tweets and posts are any indication. The Penguins were 6-2-2 in their last 10 games coming into that matchup on Wednesday night on national television against the Blackhawks in Chicago. And, of course, knowing the Penguins' recent history against the Blackhawks, I think they had lost 8 in a row. Now it's 9 in a row. Against a Blackhawks team that was slumping. I believe the Blackhawks themselves had lost 8 in a row within the context of this season, and they got out of their jam, of course, predictably, against the Penguins. I say that predictably, but it really shouldn't have been because the Penguins have been playing a lot better, and even on that night, they had the better of the shots, they had the better of the scoring chances, didn't have the better of the finishing end, both goals scored and allowed, even though Brian Russ broke out of a 21-game goalless drought with a hat trick, believe it or not. Probably could have had 4 or 5, even though the third was on a pretty good bounce. The Blackhawks don't strike me as the strongest defensive team in the world. So the Penguins, even though I think most of us would agree it wasn't the most dynamic offensive game, but they still ended up with over 40 shots on goal. And like I said, they had the better of things at 5-on-5. Yet, they were not stout enough defensively to prevent the Blackhawks from scoring 4 goals at even strength. And the Hawks added on a couple of empty netters, so the 6-3 score was a little bit deceiving, as it often is in this sport. It was a close game, but it probably shouldn't have been a close game against a Blackhawks team that's really struggling. Not as bad as their record would indicate, I would say, but still, that's a game that you would think, that you would hope the Penguins would be able to get. The disappointment was palpable in the Penguins' room after the fact. Matt Cullen, Sidney Crosby upset with the outcome and maybe part of the performance as well. Mike Sullivan disappointed that his team couldn't keep the roll going. But as I mentioned, plenty of games coming up for the Penguins here this week. They'll play 5 in 7, once it's all said and done. Tonight against the Boston Bruins. That is at PPG Paints Arena at 7 o'clock. Then tomorrow the Penguins host the Kings at PPG before taking on the Ducks, another home game, on Monday. So a chance for this team to get a roll going, or at least keep its roll going, and prove that loss at Chicago, that was ugly in some ways, was just a blip. But there are some concerns here. And when I say that I want this Penguins team to play several games in a row to see what they have before Jim Rutherford makes any more moves, I will concede that the blue line remains a weakness. Even with Justin Schultz, it's a blue line that's not going to suppress chances. It's not going to prevent a lot of chances, or at least not at an above-average rate. It was always a blue line that, when the Penguins won the Cup in 16 and 17, could move the puck up ice, could contribute offensively, but was never that great at shutting things down. Their defense, in other words, was a good offense, was possessing the puck, was not turning the puck over in the neutral zone. At least when the Penguins turn the puck over when they're playing well, it's 180 to 200 feet away from their net. And there's a lot of things that can go wrong for the opposing team coming back the other way. So that's the defense that the Penguins would play very well. And so often in hockey, I'm guilty of it as well, we don't attribute the full effect of the skill of a blue line to a team's attack. And I think that has held back the Penguins more than the ups and the downs of Evgeny Malkin, for instance, or Phil Kessel, or Derek Brassard. To use a soccer term, these offensive players need good service. They need the puck given to them in spots where they can succeed. So much of why Mike Sullivan succeeded when he took over from Mike Johnston 3 years ago was he changed the breakout. He made the Penguins forwards in a better position. He put them in a better position to take pucks with speed, to push opposing blue liners back, and to allow them to get into the offensive zone with control. That changed drastically. As I charted, I charted those games over the course of that 2015-16 season, and it did change drastically. The Penguins had so many more clean exits from their zone and clean entries into the offensive zone. And as we study hockey more and more, we realize how important that is. Passing, not to set up goals necessarily, but to facilitate offense. And the Penguins right now, as it stands, don't have a full complement of players, or even a healthy complement of players who can do that. Right now, it's Chris Letang playing at a transcendent, unbelievable level. Full credit to him. Brian Dumoulin, pretty good supporting cast player. And with Justin Schultz out, it's a rogues gallery. I think Chad Ruedel is pretty good in small sample sizes. I think Marcus Pettersson coming over from the Ducks is not bad at making a first pass. Oli Mata can play smart, but a lot of times the game and its pace seems to pass him by. And so even though he might make the right play for a player in the position that he's in, he's not often in those great positions that a player with more foot speed would be able to create for himself. So the blue line is flawed. Jamie Alexiak, maybe not the player with the highest hockey IQ, even though he has some great tools. Big body, huge shot, Pretty good skater for a player of his size. Maybe not the most agile, but pretty good when the play is going up the ice. But defending in his own end is not his strength. Jack Johnson has not done well in triggering the breakout. And that was what he was sold as to Penguins fans, to all of us who followed the team this past summer when he was signed to a 5-year contract, which a lot of us said, what are they doing? And we still feel that way. The weakness of Jack Johnson, you could actually say that his pairing with Marcus Pettersson the other night against the Blackhawks cost the Penguins that game because it was, in essence, a one-goal game, as I said. Empty netters tacked on, so we can ignore those. When Jack Johnson was on the ice, the Penguins were out-attempted 17-4 at even strength. 17-4. And I know he and Pettersson had a good night against the Senators earlier in this previous road trip, but overall, Pettersson has not been able to lift the level of Jack Johnson, and overall, Johnson has been a net negative player in getting the Penguins out of their zone and into the offensive end. So that's what the Penguins need their D to be. They don't need them to be like a shutdown unit. They don't need to be like the New Jersey Devils or even going back earlier in this decade. They don't need them to be, like the LA Kings, where they slow it down and jam things up in their own end. They need the defensemen to make plays up ice, and we're not seeing enough of that. It's just not a talented enough blue line right now. I think the Penguins' forward core is good enough, and I still think, even though we've seen Derek Brassard on Crosby's wing recently, I still think Brassard is ideally placed as a third-line center. I just think if the Penguins' forwards got pucks in better positions, then the entire team would be better off for it. Defending in their own end, goaltending, it would all be better because they would have more of the edge in terms of shots, shot attempts, and scoring chances. That's how the Penguins have won in the past, at least under Mike Sullivan. And as it is right now, they're rolling the dice on so many nights. They're betting that their top players will be better than the other team's top players and that their shooting talent will prevail over a goaltending core right now that, even though Casey DeSmith has put up pretty good traditional numbers and even some good high-danger numbers, he's unproven at this level, and Matt Murray hasn't been very good for the last year and a half. So the Penguins have to lean into their strength, and right now their D-core isn't adequate enough, it appears, to allow them to play fully into that strength. So to be continued on whether that changes and whether Jim Rutherford sees it the same way and can find a way to deal from a source of strength, maybe some upfront scoring, in order to facilitate puck-moving blue liners. That's it for Geiks Got Game. We'll end on that X's and O's note in the sport of hockey. I know many of you love that, as do I. I'm off from RMU hockey until almost the new year, so nothing to promote in that regard. I want to wish all of you a happy holiday. I'll talk to you next week at some point in time. Like I said, we'll have the date and time nailed down a little bit later. Maybe earlier next week. We'll see if we can do that. Anyway, for Nick Graybeal, I'm Matt Geika. This is Geiks Got Game, and I'm reminding you that when the radio fades, you know life's moving fast. As always, awesome to spend an hour, give or take, with you here from Millvale at Mr. Small's Theater. God bless, and I'll talk to you next week.